So for the beginning of this unit, we are going to talk about land use concepts. Unit 5 is all about land and water use. So the first main point that is brought up is something called the tragedy of the commons. And a common is an area that's owned by everyone. It's a public area. In this picture, it would be like a public pasture land, so it can't be anything that's privately owned. When they're open to unregulated exploitation, they tend to become overused, damaged, or depleted. Garrett Hardin wrote an essay in 1968 called The Tragedy of the Commons, which is where we get this idea, which was based on an age-old idea that had been around for a while, but that he was saying that when we don't have regulation, each person who grazes their animals will be motivated by self-interest to increase the number of his or her animals in the pasture. Because no single person owns the pasture, no one has incentive to expend effort taking care of it. Instead, each person takes what he or she can until the resource is depleted and overgrazed, causing the pasture's food production to collapse and harming everyone. So we call that scenario the tragedy of the commons. Some other examples of a commons other than, a pasture land could be overfishing of the oceans, clean water pollution, I guess, air pollution, global climate change, maybe even groundwater contamination. Environmental policies aim to promote fairness by dealing with external costs, harmful impacts suffered by people not involved in the actions that created them. For example, if a factory discharges waste into a river, it imposes these external costs on the downstream users of the river, such as water pollution, health problems, reduced biodiversity or fish populations, making the river ugly. So those would be considered negative externalities. You could also have air pollution from that factory. Now, a positive externality then would be the opposite, and that would be some sort of a benefit that you would gain from that being around. So in where I live, it's really close to this wonderful place where they roast nuts. So if you go running on the greenway at just the right time, you can smell these nuts roasting and cinnamon and sugar, and it's great. So that would be considered a positive externality. So a lot of economists, like Garrett Hardin, feel that private ownership and regulation is the only solution to solve the tragedy of the commons. So the idea being that when we have oversight from someone, it causes the people that use it to band together and cooperate. So if you have something that's privatized, then you would subdivide, say, the cattle field into several different private properties. Then each person that owned their own property has an incentive to conserve and maintain their portion of the resources in ways to maximize its productivity. So then we have this amazing woman, Elinor Ostrom, and she just died, I think it was 2010. And so she's from Indiana University, I believe. She won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and she showed that self-regulation can prevent the tragedy of the commons. So her self-regulation would mean that people probably maintain laws, create rules, not laws, but create rules that they follow, and then they create their own system of what to do if someone isn't paying or doing their part, or if someone is not using the resources in the right way, and that they don't actually have to be owned by someone. So she's a pretty cool lady right from around here. So when we talk about public lands, what does it really mean to be a public land? In this map, we can see marine protected areas and land protected areas in the colors blue and green, but they don't all have the same status. So a national park is doesn't have any resources that are extracted from it. It can be used for things such as conservation or tourism, but one negative externality of creating these national parks is that a lot of times they're going to displace people that used to live there. So our example would be in the Mau Forest in Kenya. This is a picture of the Mau Forest in Kenya. The Kenyan government decided to make this a national park, which means that you could use it for scientific or educational use. It could be used for recreational use, but people were living there. And so they have evicted over 10 towns worth of people from the Mau Forest. They didn't give them very much notice. So the first phase of these evictions happened in about 2007. Then they had another 40,000 people evicted in 2018, and another round of people that they evicted just in the past year, which you can envision during the COVID pandemic. It would be pretty awful to evict entire towns of people. When they did evict them, they used government officials, people that worked for the Kenyan Forest Service and other organizations, Fish and Wildlife and such. They went in armed with guns, shot the guns in the air, beat people with their gun butts, threw them to the ground, cut down their homes and burned their crops, and threw them out of the Mau Forest. It didn't even matter. They said that they had unlawfully settled in the forest, even though some families had lived there for over 30 years. And they said that these indigenous people were degrading the forest. Even though some of them had like land ownership documents and deeds, the government refused to recognize them and said that they wouldn't compensate or resettle people evicted because they were illegally occupying the land. So they set up these real makeshift communities on the edge of the forest where they are living in terrible conditions. So it's a human rights issue that is really pertinent today. We can also have managed resource protected areas. So these would be areas where they are able to use the minerals or the plants and things that are in that area. So it's considered managed like the national forests in the United States. Here is another example of a area, the Sierra del Chorrillo. I can't say it, but in this area they were have a lot of tourism. Particularly, they have bird watching and they have kayaking on the rivers and hiking and things like that that people will go and do, and it's protected by the government. We can also have species management areas where we are particularly trying to preserve a habitat. For example, in the Galapagos Islands, here you see a marine iguana. They are indigenous to the Galapagos and not found anywhere else in the world. So some of the problems with species that are living in these really small areas like the Galapagos Islands is that they have not had a lot of protection from invasive species. So in the Galapagos, they actually have a huge wild goat problem and a rat problem. So the rats come in, they will eat the iguana eggs, and they will eat the eggs of birds that are laid in the Galapagos. And the goats are more likely to eat through large amounts of cropland. So one thing that they're really working on in the Galapagos is how to prevent these invasive species or predators from getting at what's living there. We also have this area, for another example, it's a strict nature reserve called the Chang Tang. The Chang Tang is the second largest nature reserve in the world. It is so large and vast that it's about the size of Spain. It's found in Tibet, right where Tibet meets the India. So I guess essentially it's a Chinese part of China. It's what's considered a cold desert. If you see in this picture, it's home to some amazing species like wild ass, blue bears, snow leopards, things like that we don't find anywhere else in the world. So it's one of the reasons it's so preserved. The people that live there are kind of nomadic. They don't travel huge long distances, but their primary source of food is going to be from grazing animals, and so they move them around. So they actually are doing a pretty good job of maintaining that ecosystem without destroying it. So we also have protected landscapes and seascapes. These would be like beaches or orchards and villages that are important sources for tourism and recreation. This image at the bottom is of the Florida Keys, and you can see where the light blue is, those are coral reefs. So these areas are protected. You can't do anything to damage them. So there's a lot of regulations as to what you can build and how you can build, how you can set your anchor in the water and such. We also have another type of public land would be national monuments. So these are, amazing things that people have built of cultural interest. So in this image we see Christ the Redeemer at Mount Rushmore, the Taj Mahal, Champs-Élysées, well, I guess it's called the Arc de Triomphe, and the pyramids. If you want to do a comparison of size, which is kind of cool, the largest statue is the Statue of Unity in India, and it is, double the height of the Statue of Liberty and 5 times that of Christ the Redeemer. This is the Temple of Buddha. So this is the second tallest. It's amazing, and you can see in this image how tiny the people are compared to it. And this is the world's tallest statue. It's of a man who really helped India gain its independence from Great Britain. So the federal government is the largest landowner in the United States. They own 25% of the country, so as public lands, 30% of Alaska on its own. And we have those public lands divided into these different categories. So rangelands are areas that are publicly owned that are used for usually cattle, but it would be, grazing animals. National forests, parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas. When we think about conservation, we know that people should maximize their resource use based on the greatest good for everyone. And consider that there is a monetary value to things that you maybe can't put a price tag on because nobody actually owns it. You can't sell it. But that it's important to think about how beautiful something is and how important it is to nature. So we can classify lands in these different ways. Most of our federal lands are managed by these few agencies, just to bring them up. The Bureau of Land Management, also known as the BLM, the United States Forest Service, or USFS, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are the organizations that are going to, govern all of this land that we were talking about. That's found in parks, forests, wildlife refuges, wilderness areas, and such. The end.